So before we dive into the implementation details, let's go ahead and check out what you will be building. So this is our recipe application, and it is reading the recipe data, the categories, the details, the recipes itself from a recipe API. You can see right now it displays all the different categories. If I select a particular category, I can see all the different recipes in that category. And now I can select that particular recipe and I can look at all the ingredients and everything related to that recipe. All right. So I can always go back to any other recipe if I want, and I can see those recipes. So this is the whole app that we'll be building using SwiftUI and using the MVVM Design Pattern. Now let's go ahead and get started. All right, so now that you have seen what we'll be building, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we need to find out that what URL we need to go to get all the recipes. So here is the URL. All right. And you can see that in this recipe API, you can get all the categories, which is going to give you chicken, pizza, breakfast, bacon, steak, Indian, Asian. And then you can search in a particular category and you're going to get all the different dishes or recipes for that particular category. And then you can get a detail for that category or that recipe, which includes the ingredients. So it's kind of like a 3-level deep to get to ingredients. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a web service, an API, a client that can perform the fetch. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new group, and I will call it services. Now, one thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier on, is that I am using Xcode 13 release candidate, and I will be using async and await features. So if you don't have Xcode 13, you need to download it so that you can use the async and await features and also the actors in iOS or for this application. Okay, so I added the services folder. Let's go ahead and add our web service, which will be a simple Swift file. I will call it web service. Okay. So the whole point of this web service would be to perform a request. Now we need a couple of different functions, right? We need get all categories. We need get recipe for selected category. And we also need get recipe details so that we can get the ingredients and everything. So you can implement these as 3 different functions, or we can go ahead and implement one function that is generic and is going to help us not write all these functions, but only one function. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a class called web service. And in this function or in this service, I'm going to go ahead and create a get function where you can get anything that is decodable. We are going to make sure that we are passing in the URL. And since every type of response can be decoded differently, we will pass in the parse as a parameter or as our argument, which is a closure. It's going to take in the data and it's going to return us whatever the type is. And now we can say async throws t, basically we're going to return something. All right. So this part that we have added, which is the actual parse part, this is very important because if we are using just one function to get the data, then we have to provide the caller the ability to parse that data. All right. Now you can see that right now it's telling us that everything has to be in iOS 15. So just make sure that we go and update it to iOS 15 because async and await is only available in iOS 15 at this particular moment. Okay. Now we can go ahead and perform our request. So we can use URL session.shared.data and we can pass in a particular URL, which is already passed to us. We don't really need a delegate or anything like that. We'll use try await. Since this is an async function, it's going to return us data and it's going to return us response. Now we can check if the data actually exists, and if it doesn't exist, we can throw some sort of an error. We can define our error right over here as two different kind of errors, like a bad request or decoding error. Next, we can try to cast our response and check that if the status is 200, meaning if you got something back correctly. If you don't got something back, then we simply go ahead and say bad request. Next up, we're going to go ahead and get the result. We're going to call the parse function. With the data, we are going to get some sort of a result. If we don't get the result, then we can probably some sort of a decoding error took place, and we can throw the decoding error. Else we can simply go ahead and return a result. Perfect. Right? Okay, so a couple of different things we need to make sure over here is we have created this web service and it's going to be performing on a type which is decodable. So now we need to go ahead and create those types. Now looking at this record, if I go ahead and click on the categories, this is what we get back. So we're just interested in the categories for right now. So we can display all the categories for the recipes. And these categories are chicken, pizza, breakfast, bacon, steak, Indian, and Asian. These are not the actual recipes. These are simply the categories of the recipe. So we need to make sure that we have a model on which we can decode this JSON result. So now we're going to go ahead and create the model. These models can also be known as DTO or data transfer objects, because these are not really the domain models. The whole point of these models is to simply allow us to, get that data and then decode it, and that's pretty much it. I'm going to go ahead and add a new item over here. Let's call it recipe category response.swift. Okay, we will say struct recipe category response, which is decodable. Now, recipe category response will represent the top part of it, this one. So you can see that we need to have a property in there, which is categories, which contains the actual categories. So let's go ahead and create a property called categories. And this will be of type recipe category. This model we don't really have right now, so we can go ahead and create it. We will call it recipe category decodable. And now the different properties. So looking at a recipe category, we can see that we need a couple of different properties. We need the image URL and we need the title. So I'm just going to use the same exact name, so I don't really have to perform any mapping, and title, and that will be string. Okay, so our models are done, at least these models that can display the categories. Now the question is, we need to create a view model that can utilize the web service and get all the models and then transfer it or to map it to the view models. So let's go ahead and first create a new group, and I'll call it view models. So the particular view model that we are trying to build is the one that represents the entire screen of recipe categories. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new model, and I will call it recipe category list view model. So very descriptive name. This will be a class recipe category list view model. This will be an observable object. It will have only one function, which will say populate categories. You can say populate recipe categories also. And this will be an async function. Inside this function, we are going to take advantage of the web service class that we build, we can go ahead and pass in a URL. Now, we need to get the URL. We already have the URL, but it will be a good idea to create some sort of a utility where we can get all these different URLs. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a utils folder. And in that, I'm just going to go ahead and add another file called constants. The whole point of constants is simply to provide constant values. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and say constants, a struct. Inside that struct, I can go ahead and create another struct. And now I can create recipe category URL. There we go. Now, some of you might be wondering, hey, hold on a second. You are using a force unwrapping. This is so bad. It's actually not that bad, or it's not bad at all, basically, because I know this URL is correct. I mean, nobody is injecting anything in this URL, so it should be okay. All right. Okay. Now let's go ahead and call this. So I can go ahead and say constants dot URLs dot recipe category URL. And this is going to give us opportunity to parse. So this is important part. That's the reason that we added this parse functionality or this parse closure, because now we can parse the data. So I can say JSON decoder dot decode, and we can decode it to a recipe category response, the one that we just created, and we will return it simply. All right. Now let's go ahead and make sure that we call this with try await, because web service is a async function. This is hopefully going to give us a recipe category response. And we can also implement try over here or catch over here. Maybe like something bad happens, we can go ahead and print it out. Okay. So after we are making sure that we are writing it correctly, see, it's kind of getting like a little bit crowded over here. Once we get the category response or recipe category response, we can map through it and create recipe category view model. So recipe category list view model represents the entire screen, which displays all the different categories. The recipe category view model, which we will implement now, is going to be representing one particular category that is what we are displaying. So I'm just going to go ahead and create it over here, recipe category view model. I'm going to make this identifiable so I can loop through it. And in order to conform to identifiable, I have to implement ID. I'll provide some sort of ID. And I will say recipe category. So this is where we will actually pass in the actual model, recipe category. And then in the init, and the reason that I'm creating initializer or init is because I want to initialize my recipe category, which is a private property. So nobody else should be able to access it, because they shouldn't. They should only be accessing the values or the properties that I'm going to expose, like this one, title, which belong to recipe category view model. So recipe category dot title var. And the reason is that once you have a DTO object, which in this case is our recipe category right here, the DTO object may contain a lot of different properties that may not be suitable to be displayed on the screen. And that's the reason we are using the MVVM design pattern, so that we can only expose the properties that we want to display on the screen. And in this case, we only have two properties that we want to display on screen, the title and the image URL. Okay. So now let's go back. Another thing that we need to do inside recipe category list view model is to create an array of recipe category view model. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. And finally, we should be able to simply map through it. Recipe category response.categories.map. And now we can pass in the recipe category view model.init. This is going to return us the recipe categories, which is recipe category view model defined over here. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful about over here is that since the recipe categories is marked with published, you have to make sure that whenever you're assigning it, which we are doing on line number 21, you're always assigning it on the main queue, on the main thread. But right now, we're not really assigning it on the main thread, right? So we can use a dispatch main queue and all that stuff. But since I'm using iOS 15 and Xcode 13, I can use a main actor, which means that every single property and every single function that will be called on recipe category list view model, it will be called on the main thread automatically. So we don't really have to provide anything over here because it will automatically be called on the main thread. Okay, so this is done. This is great. The next thing we need to move on to is to create our actual screen, recipe category list screen. So let's go ahead and create a new group, and I will call it recipe category list screen. Well, hold on a second. I'll just call it screens. This is just the name of the folder. And inside over there, I'm going to go ahead and add a file. Recipe category list screen. Now the screen represents the entire screen where you will display the recipe categories, and it can be divided into some other views. Now some of you might say that, okay, why are we doing that? Why are we creating a screen? Why can't we just create a view, which screen is also a view, that just displays the recipe categories? You can do that, but by creating a kind of like a container, a recipe category list screen, it gives us a little bit more flexibility to add more things to it. Maybe we want to add a segmented control to filter category by their course, or we want to search a category. So in all of those cases, it's definitely going to help us. Okay. All right. So here's our recipe category list screen. The first thing we need to do is to create the recipe category list view model. So let's go ahead and create that with a state object. We also want to make sure that we are using a navigation view. So let's go ahead and create or use a navigation view. You can see that it's complaining over here in the previews because we need to pass in something to it in order to construct a recipe category view model. Basically, it's saying that, hey, you need to pass in something. Now I can go ahead and initialize this. Should be able to initialize it over here, and now it should be okay. So you can do that if you want to. All right. Let's go ahead and build it again. Okay. So we have the navigation view, and what we want to do is we want to display our categories. Now I can go ahead and perform the list over here if I want to, right? I mean, in the end, we actually do want to display a list of all the recipe categories, but maybe we can do better. Maybe we can create a view that is responsible for displaying all the categories. I'm just going to go ahead and add a new group. I'll call it views. And it's always a good idea to start breaking things down. So maybe in the future, if I actually wanted to create or to display recipe category list view, I can just pass the recipe categories to this particular view. So recipe category list view. There we go. So recipe category list view, let's go ahead and implement this. In order to create that, we will pass in recipe category view model, an array of recipe category view model. We can go ahead and create or run a loop on the categories. We will get a category, which is a recipe category. And now we can go ahead and display a recipe category, right? Now in this case, again, maybe it will make sense to create another view that just displays an individual recipe category. So I'm just going to go ahead and create another view, recipe category cell view. And this particular view will be responsible for just displaying the actual recipe category. So still breaking it further down. Recipe category view model. So individual stuff that we're trying to basically display. Now for this, I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste an H stack, horizontal stack, that will allow us to display all of those different things along with the image. So you can see right here, we are displaying some stuff. I can remove the preview part. I don't really want to preview over here at this moment. Let's go back. Okay. So if we go back to our recipe category, again, I mean, you can remove the preview if you want, because if you want to create a preview, you need to pass in the recipe categories. All right. So you can create those things in JSON, or you can do it over here. Maybe that is something we can look at it later on. For now, we can simply remove that. Okay, so let's go ahead and call recipe category cell view, passing in the category. So that hopefully will display us the recipe categories at least, right? And now finally we can go back to our screen where we can start displaying these things. Now you might be thinking, well, that's a lot of work. These all the things that you're doing, the refactoring and composing these views, they are going to come in handy later on in the project. So the investment that you're doing right now is going to pay dividends later on. Model.recipe categories .task. Now the task is something that is added in iOS 15 and Xcode 13, which allows you to perform some sort of an async action when this particular view is basically loaded. So this is really a great place to perform our call for model.populate categories. And let's go ahead and add also a navigation title. I'm just going to go ahead and call it recipes, like this is our recipes app or something. Now we also have to make sure that recipe category list screen is our main screen. So let's do a jump into the app file and just use the recipe category list screen. All right, let's go back to our screen. And let's go ahead and play. Okay, there we go. It's loading. And there we go. We got all the categories being displayed. So we were able to load all the categories from an API, and we were able to display it. Isn't that great? I mean, it took us a little bit of work, but all of the things that we have done that are going to pay dividends later on. All right. Now, a couple of different things we need to do. Let's go back to, let's pin this. And let's go jump into the list view. I want to see that the list is being displayed, but I want to use the plain style. Let's see if it works. Here we go. Okay, great. So at this point, we are displaying all the recipe categories. That part is done. Now the next part we need to work on is when we select a particular category, then we will go ahead and fetch all the actual recipes from that particular category. So let's go ahead and work on that now. So we'll start with creating our recipe list screen. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead into the screen, add a new file, subfile. We will call it recipe list screen. This particular screen will be responsible for displaying all the recipes. So when we select a particular category, this screen is the one that will display all the recipes for that particular category. So for this, we need to make sure that you are passing in the category. So there we go, recipe category view model somewhere, recipe category view model, there we go. And in order to control this screen, we will have to create another view model. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, before we do that, you can see over here it's again complaining, right? It's basically saying that, hey, you need to pass in the recipe category view model. Now, if I go ahead and do that, so let's go ahead and create recipe category view model, recipe category view model. So we can get at least some sort of a preview working. So recipe category view model, you can see that we need to pass in the recipe category. So recipe category, and I can pass in the image, some sort of an image and some sort of a title. All right. So let's go ahead and see if we can find an image URL for a recipe and a title. So if I go over here, this is the image URL, and I will say copy link address. There we go. And it's just chicken. So let's go ahead and type chicken. All right. And now if I go ahead and say recipe list screen, I can pass in a recipe category, which we just created, and hopefully it will be happy. There we go. Now, eventually, if you are doing this a lot over here, it might be a good idea to create an extension on a recipe category view model and put all of this information into a JSON file in the preview content and then load it from there, instead of writing this again and again. So this can become like a lot of work if you're doing it again and again. All right. Okay, so recipe list screen, we have a recipe category view model. We don't really have a view model behind the recipe list screen. So we need to implement recipe list view model. So just like before, I'm just going to go ahead and add another file, and I will call it recipe list view model. It's a view model just like any other view model that we have created. So let's go ahead and implement recipe list view model. And recipe list view model will be responsible for the screen that displays you all the different recipes. And it will be very, very similar to the recipe category list view model. All right. So we will go ahead and create the class recipe list view model, which will be an observable object. We will also decorate this with main actor, which basically means that all the different properties and function inside recipe list view model will be automatically called on the main thread. And the great thing about the web service that we implemented with a generic function get is that we can still utilize this function, but map it to a different kind of result, like a recipe view model. All right, and it will return us a recipe response. So if we go back over here, you can see that if you're searching for a recipe, you will get a recipe response which will look like this, which is different from recipe category responses that we were getting for the categories. So now we need to make sure that we have a model that can map to this. So let's go ahead and go to our model folder. And inside the model folder, I'm going to go ahead and add a new structure. I will call it recipe. And this is simply going to represent the recipe that we are going to get from the server. So we have a recipe response, which will contain all the recipes, and each recipe will have an ID, an image URL, and a title. And we make sure that the name of the properties are matching. If they're not matching, then you can do like a coding keys and all that. But we're just trying to make sure that we don't do much work and we are just complying with all the things that are getting returned from the JSON response. So ID, title, and image URL. There we go. Okay, now let's go back to our recipe list view model. And in the recipe list view model, we will have a function that is going to give us the recipes. All right. So this is a function that is going to give us the list of recipes, and it's going to start mapping it to recipe view model. So we have to create the view model also, which is simple. We can simply go ahead and add that. The recipe view model takes in a recipe. You can see that it has an ID, title, image URL, but there's a problem with the recipe view model. We don't really want anyone to access the recipe. So I'm just going to go ahead and make it private and add an initializer. where you can pass in a recipe so that nobody can access our model. If they want to access something, they can only access the view model. All right. Now, in our recipe list view model, just like before, we need to expose a list of recipes, an array of recipes. So here it is, and we have used it on line number 22. The final thing we need to do is the URL. So we need to construct a URL based on the recipe category. The URLs that we are constructing are in the file called URLs or constants. And right over here, we can add another function that can simply return us a URL for a recipe based on the category name. Let's go ahead and build it. And this is going to be the recipe list view model. Now let's go back to the recipe list screen. The recipe list screen will be the one who is actually using the recipe list view model. So let's go ahead and create that instance. And once again, we can display everything right over here, but it might be a good idea to create and compose it into smaller views. So we can go ahead and create a recipe list view, just like we have created a recipe category view. All right. So I'm going to go into my views folder, add a new view, recipe list view. Okay. So what should we do inside recipe list view? Well, the recipe list view is responsible for displaying you all the recipes. So in this particular view, you are going to be passing in the recipes, which basically means you'll be passing in the recipe view model. We can go in the body. We can go ahead and iterate over the recipes. You can use the ID. Now, let's go ahead and, well, actually, yeah, the recipe view model does have an ID, so we don't really have to make it identifiable if we don't want to. Recipe in, and we will go ahead and display a recipe cell view now, all right, where we can pass in each recipe. Now again, where is the recipe cell view coming from? Well, we have to construct it, all right. So let's go back, and I will simply remove that because I'm not in the mood to implement this part, but you can, all right. So recipe cell view, let's go ahead and create that somewhere. Where is our views folder? We will call it recipe cell view. Perfect. And I'm just going to copy paste it because once you have done it one time, it's pretty similar. You can see the recipe cell view takes in a recipe view cell and displays the image and the title of the recipe, and that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and build it. Okay. So if we go back to our recipe list screen, now we can start using our recipe list view. So let's remove this text and just use a recipe list view, passing in the recipes, recipe list view model dot recipes dot task. And this is where we can go ahead and await for a recipe list view model dot populate recipe with a category name. We already are passing the category name from the title, so we can utilize that. Great. All right. Now, one thing you will note is that from the recipe category list screen, there is no way currently to go to a different URL. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and jump into the recipe category list view. So let's go ahead and jump over there and implement it somewhere over here. I do believe that this does tightly couple things. All right. I do believe that recipe category list view should get some sort of a notification or callback from the recipe cell view or the recipe category cell view that something is selected, and then you can navigate somewhere. Because right now, what we're doing is I'm just going to go inside there and implement the navigation link. And what this will allow us to do is to always go to a particular destination. So it does kind of confine things for us. It's very tight coupled. All right. But the other way around was a little bit more complicated if you want to check this out. But for now, in our example, it is okay if we are just using this for now. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start using let's go ahead and pass in the destination. So the destination where we want to go from the recipe category list view is the recipe list screen, passing in the recipe or passing in the category. All right. And this is going to be our label. Let's go ahead and build it. Okay, let's go ahead and run it to see if we can go from recipe category list screen to displaying all the recipes. So if I just run this application right now, you can see that I can see all the categories. Let's click on the chicken, and there we go. So we are able to go and fetch all the different chickens or chicken recipes. Now it would be a good idea to display my selected category on the top, right? So let's go ahead and work on that. So in the recipe, this one, we can simply call over here the navigation title and pass in the selected category. Category.title. All right, let's go ahead and build it. Okay, let's go back to the recipe category, start from the beginning. These are all the categories. If I click on the pizza, I can see the pizza, so that's always good. And I can see all the different pizza dishes. These are all the recipes based on the name that we selected. If I go and click on the steak, I can get all the steak. Perfect, right? Now the final step that we need to do is if we click on a particular recipe, let's say if I click on steak fajitas over here, then I should be able to go to a recipe detail screen, and it should show me the image as well as kind of like the ingredients used in the recipe. So that's our final step that we need to take. So let's go ahead and see how we can build the recipe detail screen. In order to build the recipe detail screen, we will go back to our API, and here is the recipe detail. Let's go ahead and click on one of them. And this is the response that we're getting. We're getting the recipe, which has an image URL, which has a title, and it has ingredient array. So we have to display all the ingredients also. So the first thing we're going to do is we will create a particular model to represent the recipe detail. All right. So I'm going to go to the models, add a brand new file. It's a Swift file. You can name this anything you want. I'm just going to call it recipe detail response. And I will go ahead and create the response part, the detail response part, which is kind of like the top level. So we're basically targeting this part. And now the recipe is we still have to create that's going to target the detail part of it. There we go. All right. Okay, so that is good. The other thing we need to do is we need to create the view model that will represent everything that is happening on the recipe detail screen. So again, we're going to go back to the view model, going to add a new file, recipe detail view model. All right. Class recipe detail view model. Again, it's going to be observable object, and we're going to decorate it with main actor. Okay. Now there are a couple of different things we need to display for recipe detail. We need to get the image URL. We need to get the title. We need to get the ingredients. So I'm just going to go ahead and basically create all of those different things. And we need to have a function to get the recipe detail based on the recipe ID. So this is that function. One thing we need to still work on is the actual constants.url part. So provided the recipe ID, we should get the URL to get the recipe details. So let's go ahead and grab that code. It will be simply a static function which will return you a URL. Perfect. Let's go back. Let's go ahead and build it. Okay. That is great. Now we can actually go and work on our screen, which will be called recipe detail screen. So I can go ahead and add a new one. SwiftUI view recipe detail screen. And in the recipe detail screen, we will have a couple of different things. We will have a recipe category. Sorry, not category, because the recipe detail screen is based on the recipe ID and not the category, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Recipe ID. We will also go ahead and create our view model. All right. Now you can see the preview is complaining because we need to pass in the ID. So let's go ahead and pass in some sort of ID over here. I'm just going to go ahead and say 36498, which is some sort of recipe. Okay, so that's fine. And now we can go ahead and create our view. We don't really want a text box to be displayed over here or a text to be displayed. So now we can go ahead and construct our view. View is kind of up to you. I'm just going to use kind of like the same approach of displaying a couple of different things. And I'm going to go ahead and add a bit of a padding. And in the task, I'm just going to make sure that we are using the recipe detail view model dot populate recipe detail and passing in the recipe ID. Because without that, we won't be able to fetch anything anyways. We also need to get the bounds of the screen, so we can actually get that from the UI screen, or you can use the geometry reader if you want to. Okay. So let's see how this kind of gets displayed. And we'll go ahead and make a request. So this is how it will look like, the recipe detail. All right, so it looks fine. The only thing now that is left to do is to hook up the recipe list screen to recipe detail screen. All right. So the process for this will be quite similar as you have already done. So I'm going to jump into my view, which is a recipe list view. And when we're displaying this, we're just going to go ahead and wrap this with a navigation link. This does actually allows you to couple very tightly, which I don't really like, but the other way around is actually much longer, which I will probably show you in the future. But you can always search for reusable views or composable views videos that I have created, and that is going to allow you to do that. It is quite a bit of work to make it less coupled. All right. And I can copy this over here. Okay, so I think that is going to allow us to hook it up. The other thing we can do is we can add a navigation title, and the navigation title should be the recipe title. So we will say recipe dot title, so that when we land on the recipe detail screen, we should at least see the title. And now we're good to give it a try. So this is the category screen. Let's go ahead and select pizza. So these are all the different pizzas that are being displayed now. Great. And now I'm going to select a Japanese pizza, and I can see the details of the Japanese pizza. Great. So it's a multi-level application that we have created, which allows us to go from a category to a list screen, and from this list screen to a detail screen. So I think this is really great that we were able to do that in not that much time. It does took a bit of a code for us because we were organizing our code into a more composable kind of architecture using MVVM, but it did allow us to create this app much quickly. All right. So there you have it. I really hope that you have enjoyed this video, and give it a thumbs up and share this video, subscribe to this channel, and thank you so much. If you like this video and want to support my channel, then check out my courses on Udemy. I have a lot of different courses on iOS development on Udemy, including my courses on RX Swift, MVVM Design Pattern, a 25+ hour course on SwiftUI. I also have courses for core data, Swift for intermediate advanced iOS developers, and I actually just released my brand new course, which is on creating your SwiftUI apps with recipes. All right. So let me show you where that course is, if I can find it. And that's an amazing course also. It just got released right over here. SwiftUI Cookbook with over 100 recipes for building iOS apps. So this is an 11-hour course, and it contains over 100 recipes, those small recipes, so you can learn how to build certain aspects of your application using SwiftUI. So definitely check out this course. All the links to the course are right there in the YouTube description. So make sure that you use the link to buy this course. And this is a brand new course that just got released, and I'm really sure that you are going to love this course. So thank you so much. Again, go ahead and subscribe. Please share the video, give it a thumbs up, and see you next week. Thank you so much.